Okay, so here we're switching to the human at this point, and we're going to look at first some muscles on the back, superficial back, and then we're going to switch over to our arm model and look at the muscles there. Okay, so the first muscle we're looking at is this muscle here, which is the trapezius muscle. Okay, now the trapezius has two halves, one over here and the other one over here. You can see how that each one is basically a triangle, and when you put the two together it makes this beautiful kind of diamond shaped muscle on the posterior surface. Okay, now one of the things you need to remember about the trapezius is that the origins are close to the midline, the insertions are lateral. Okay, so everything at the midline that this muscle is touching is part of its insertion. So you can see that we have the occipital bone, we have the spines of specific vertebrae, namely C7 and all of the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, and then the insertions are lateral. Okay, and the insertions, if we kind of turn this model around a little bit, you can see that this actually, the trapezius actually extends over the shoulder and the inferior neck to come and connect anteriorly. So it has origins from the acromion, or excuse me, insertions from the acromion of the scapula, the spine of the scapula, and then the lateral third of the clavicle. Okay, so clavicle, acromion, spine of the scapula. Those are all of the insertions for the trapezius muscle. Okay, then the other prominent muscle that you can see here, and it always has amazed me that they never put a number on this muscle on this particular model. It's one of the most important muscles that we have in the back. This is the latissimus dorsi muscle. Okay, again, we have one latissimus dorsi over here, the other one is over here. Okay, and so commonly referred to as the lats, just like the trapezius is commonly referred to as the traps. Okay, latissimus dorsi, again, many of its origins are medial, but not completely, because you can see that it's attached to this broad gray area here. So actually we're getting a little bit lateral with some of its origins as well. Okay, so we have spinous processes again. So we're kind of picking up part way through the trapezius's origins. And we have the spinous processes of T7 through L5. So we're continuing to more inferior sections of the vertebral column. We have origins from this medial section of the iliac crest, and we also have origins from the medial sections of ribs 9 through 12. Okay, now the insertion of the latissimus dorsi is on the humerus in the intertubercular sulcus, which you really can't see here, but it's actually attaching to the same location as the pectoralis major, but just from the opposite side. And that's why they're antagonists. Okay, so the pectoralis major is going to be your prime mover for flexion at the shoulder, because when it contracts, it's going to pull the arm basically this way. And latissimus dorsi is attaching from this side, so when it contracts, it's going to produce the opposite movement of extension at the of the arm at the shoulder. Okay. All right, so we're going to switch out the model and switch in our arm model. And we'll start with this beautiful muscle. I'll be taking some muscles off as we go through. This beautiful muscle right here is the deltoid muscle. Okay, so you can see has this kind of beautiful fan shape. Okay, the origins of the deltoid are actually the same as the insertion of the trapezius muscle. Okay, so we have origins from the lateral third of the clavicle, the acromion, and the spine of the scapula. Okay, now the insertion is going to be at a single point, and that is at the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. Okay, and this muscle has a prime mover action of abduction at the shoulder, but because it has some fibers that are anterior and some fibers that are posterior, and you can actually activate those fibers independently, you can produce some contribution to flexion and medial rotation with the anterior fibers. You can produce some contribution to extension and lateral rotation with the posterior fibers. So I think of it as being able to do pretty much everything as far as our angular movements except for adduction. Okay, that's really the only thing it can't do. Okay, now I'm going to remove the deltoid. Actually, before I remove the deltoid, I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that where the deltoid comes to its insertion point, it's actually pointing to this muscle here. And this muscle is the brachialis muscle. Okay? Now, the origins of the brachialis are from the anterior surface of the distal end of the humerus. It inserts on the coronoid process of the ulna. So like the biceps brachii, it's going to be an important flexor of the elbow. Okay, and you can see most of the brachialis from this view on the lateral part of the upper limb. If I remove the deltoid, and here's the biceps brachii, if I remove that, you can actually see the brachialis in its entirety. Okay, so I'm going to put the biceps back now, and here's the brachialis, and then we can see some of it over here as well. Okay, and you can see how these two muscles are, you know, really nestled together very nicely, so it makes sense that they would be doing the same job. Okay, let's come back up to the scapula area, and we're going to look at the muscles associated with the scapula. Okay, we have the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the teres minor, the teres major, and if we turn this guy over here, we can see the subscapularis. Okay, now 4 of these muscles, all of them except for the teres major, so we're going to ignore this little guy for a minute. These 4 muscles, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis, are the muscles of the rotator cuff. Okay, and the rotator cuff is a very important group of muscles that helps to stabilize the shoulder joint by literally putting tension on the head of the humerus and holding it in the glenoid cavity. So remember looking at the head of the humerus and the glenoid cavity, and they really don't fit very well together. So there's not a lot of stability as far as the fit between the scapula and the humerus at that location. So the muscle tone of the muscles of the rotator cuff add a lot of stability to this joint. Okay, and there are also ligaments in this area, but it's, you know, no matter what you do, it's inherently an unstable joint. Okay, so the supraspinatus has its origins from the supraspinous fossa. Its insertion is on the greater tubercle of the humerus. Infraspinatus, from the infraspinous fossa, again, its insertion is the greater tubercle of the humerus. Okay, the teres minor has its origin from the lateral border of the scapula, and you guessed it, its insertion is on the greater tubercle. The only one that's different is the one that's on the opposite side of the scapula. Okay, the subscapularis has its origin from the subscapular fossa, but it inserts into the lesser tubercle. Okay, so if you're in the rotator cuff, all the muscles on the same side, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, all have a similar insertion on the greater tubercle of the humerus. The subscapularis is the only one that's different It's on the opposite side of the scapula, and it has an insertion on the lesser tubercle. Okay. The teres minor is in this area, but it does not have, or teres major, excuse me, is the one that's on this side, but does not have a role in the rotator cuff, and you're not responsible for its origin and insertion, so I'm just going to move on from that one. Okay, so let's take a look at the other muscles that we have here near our brachialis, which we already talked about. The one that you can see here is the biceps brachii. Bi means two, and you can see we have a little division here superiorly, and the muscle seems to break up into two components. These are where you can see the two heads of the biceps brachii. We were talking in lab about whether you could see much of a division in humans, in that sometimes you can see a little bit of a indentation in the muscle in some individuals, but for the most part, any place where you would really be able to see that division. I'm going to put the deltoid back on here. A lot of that's going to be covered up by the combination of the deltoid, and then you're also going to have the pectoralis major muscle inserting here. So you really can't see too much of those heads without having the specimen dissected a bit more. Okay, so the biceps brachii has its short head origin on the coracoid process, the origin of its, and that would be this one right here. Okay, the long head is the one whose tendon goes up through the intertubercular sulcus, and you may remember from lab that the other name for the intertubercular sulcus is the bicipital groove, and that's why, because the long head of the biceps brachii runs right through that indentation. Okay, the insertion of the biceps brachii, both heads have a common insertion on the radial tuberosity. So we have the radial tuberosity being pulled by the biceps brachii. We have the coronoid process being pulled by the brachialis. So when those two muscles contract, that's a nice strong stimulus for us to get flexion at our elbow. Okay, now the antagonist to the biceps brachii is the triceps brachii. Okay, and we had three heads, have three heads here, just like in the cat. The lateral head is the most lateral, the long head is the longest, and the medial head is the most medial. Okay, the origins of the triceps brachii, the long head is from the edge of the glenoid cavity. The lateral and medial heads are from the posterior humerus. Okay, and they all have a common insertion on the olecranon process of the elbow, of the ulna, excuse me, to give you extension at the elbow. Okay. Okay, so I think that's it for our origins and insertions. Now we're just going to look at some names of muscles. Okay, and we're going to look at our two sets of muscles in the forearm. And I just want to remind you of some things that I mentioned in lecture, but if you didn't have, or in lab, but if you didn't have me for lab, then you're going to be hearing them for the first time. So, first of all, we have two compartments in the forearm. We have the anterior compartment, and we have the posterior compartment. Okay, now anatomical position is how these are named. So I'm going to just kind of hold this arm as if it were my arm, and this is anatomical position. So anterior is here, and any muscle that's in this area, I shouldn't say any muscle, but most of the muscles that are in this area are going to cause flexion distally. Okay, and if we turn over and we look at the posterior compartment, most of the muscles in this compartment are going to cause extension, okay, distally. Okay, now where exactly is the action of the muscle going to happen? You're going to know that from the second name of the muscle. If it's a flexor carpi, then that means its insertion is on the wrist, the carpal bones. Okay, so it's going to cause flexion at the wrist. If it's a flexor digitorum, that means it's causing flexion of the digits, which would be the fingers in this case. Okay, so the second name is telling you where the action of that muscle is occurring. And remember, the more movable end of the muscle is the insertion. So that means it has to be the insertion end that we're looking at where the movement is occurring. Okay? Now, the third part of the name will tell you more information about that muscle, like maybe more specifically where it's attached. Okay, so we have a flexor carpi radialis, and we have a flexor carpi ulnaris. Okay, so those names are telling us that these are both muscles that cause flexion at the wrist, but one is attached to the radial side of the wrist, the other one is attached to the ulnar side of the wrist. Okay, so remember, pinky side is the ulnar side, thumb side is the radial side. That's where you go to take a radial pulse. Okay. All right, so flexor carpi radialis, here's the insertion, radial side of the wrist. Flexor carpi ulnaris, here's the insertion, ulnar side of the wrist. Okay. The flexor digitorum muscles are named superficialis and profundus. Superficialis sounds like superficial because it's the one that's closer to the surface or more external. Okay, so we're not doing this muscle, which is the palmaris longus. So just imagine that that one was peeled away, and the muscle that's here, kind of between the flexor carpi radialis and the flexor carpi ulnaris, would be the flexor digitorum superficialis. Okay, if we remove this set of muscles, then we can see the flexor digitorum profundus. Okay, now profundus is a derivation of the word profound. Okay, so if somebody says that's profound, that's really deep. Okay, that's how they're using profound here. Okay, so this is the deeper flexor digitorum muscle. Okay. Now the other muscle in the anterior compartment that doesn't have the same naming system is this one right here. This is the pronator teres, and this has attachments that allow us to produce pronation. Okay, so if your arm is in the anatomical position, you contract this muscle. It will pull the radius across the ulna to put you into the pronated position. Okay, we're going to go over to the opposite side now, the posterior compartment. Here's our extensor digitorum. This is really easy to see that it's going to the digits. You can get to this beautiful tendon here and see how it's dividing up to go to all the fingers. Okay, so that's our extensor digitorum. Okay, we have a couple of muscles right here that are associated with extension also. And this is the extensor carpi radialis longus, because this is the longer of the two muscles that do this. And then this is the extensor carpi radialis brevis. Okay, so both of these cause extension at the wrist. They attach to the radial side or thumb side of the wrist. The longus is long, the brevis is short. And the last muscle on this compartment to take a look at, then we'll go to one deeper, the brachioradialis. Okay, this is another important elbow flexor. And then if we remove this piece and this one, we'll see our last muscle, which is the supinator muscle. And that produces the opposite action of the pronator teres by pulling the radius back so it's parallel with the ulna to go to the supinated position.